I've been looking more into the story of Jacob, and if you guys remember, does anybody remember the story of Jacob wrestling with God and how God used that to go dig up some old things in his life, and he brought it to the surface, and Jacob wouldn't give up. And remember, the question wasn't how do you get Jacob to start fighting? The question is how do you get Jacob to stop fighting? And God, removes his ability to physically fight, and he changes his name. But does anybody remember what he changed his name to? Israel. And when he changed his name to Israel, Israel means wrestles with God. Now, we could make the argument of like, well, that's a nationality name, but John chapter 10, verse 16 says this, "And other sheep I have," this is talking about the Gentiles, "which are not of this fold, them I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd." So if we wanted to take, well, Israel, we're not Israelites, and that is true. However, this concept, the name that God gave his people was wrestles with God. And now the fact that he said that is less interesting to me than why he said that. Because I wasn't raised in a wrestles with God concept. I was raised, anybody ever heard this? You probably finish this. This is a famous American line. God said it, I believe it, that slay it'll see it. And that's a Southern thing. That's what we say. We go to church, and that's just, and that was my theology. God said it, I believe it, that settles it. And here's what I learned this week as I'm wrestling through the why. Why would God give us the name wrestles with God? Because in my mind, wrestles with God seems to be the opposite of God said it, I believe it, that settles it. So there's this tension, and it's a word you're going to hear a lot. There's this tension between, because I know the Bible talks about submitting to God. I know the Bible talks about submitting your heart to God, so I don't think that submitting to God is a bad thing. In fact, I think it's the best thing. But that's not what God named us. And in fact, here's what I learned this week as I'm trying to make sense of all this. The name Muslim means submitted to God. So I'm like, I don't have time. I've got to preach on something, and I'm not, because listen, I was raised in a submitted to God, not a wrestles with God. And God says, I'm going to give you the name wrestles with God, which means God is not so insecure that he is threatened by us questioning or asking or digging or wrestling. And yet the Muslim faith, which started through Ishmael, do your own research, is that it goes all the way back to biblical times, but it calls itself submitted to God. And just the way that I was raised, I would think that one sounds more accurate. So then I'm just made of questions. James chapter 4, verse 7 says, "Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he'll flee from you." There's so much about the concept of submitting to God that is accurate. However, there's a reason God gave us the name he gave us. Okay, I'm going to tell you a story. It's a true story. There's a story about a monk. He was a young monk, and the concept is that he's driven through this performance to find acceptance from God. He's on a mission. He's on the track. He is going for it. He's going to be the best monk. It's a true story. I'll tell you the rest in a minute. But he wasn't just going to be a monk. He wanted to be the best monk. His words were this: "I tortured myself with prayer, fasting, vigils, and freezing." He would sleep in the snow. Like, he was so dedicated to this concept of, robbing himself of the things that brought about, sin in his life. "The frost alone might have killed me. What else did I seek by doing this but God, who was supposed to note my strict observance of the monastic order and my austere life?" I know this. I know that because I was raised with the belief of submitting to God was the only acceptable form of interaction. And I wasn't ever told that. Listen, I'm not blaming anybody. I'm not saying that that's what my parents specifically told me. It's not that. It's just somewhere in there, that's what I got. That was just what I took away from, is it submitted to God. And then in moments where I wasn't submitted to God, then what do? I want to be submitted to God. I'm supposed to be submitted to God. And it seems like as I'm listening to the story of this monk who's like, I'm going all in. I wasn't sleeping in the snow, but there were moments where I thought, if I just did this, if I was just better. Have you ever thought that you would be a better witness to what God's done in your life if you were a better Christian? See, the problem is, if we are named wrestle, this is what I'm saying. I don't even know if this is going to be a sermon this morning. It might just be me asking a bunch of questions and like, come back next week. If we were given the name wrestles with God, and your interaction with God is that you sit in church and you listen to the sermon and you try to be good, then you're not even acting according to the name that God gave you. We have built this thing here, and it's good, but I don't think it's complete yet. Because until we have a mechanism that allows you to walk in and go, I'm wrestling with God on something, then we're on some level missing the process. If you are only listening to me wrestle, then you are missing out on the things that God has in your individual life. Change doesn't come corporately, change comes individually. No matter how good I am, that doesn't directly affect you. No matter how much of the word I know, your wrestling match is what brings about improvement in your life. I can't do it for you. And so no matter how much I dig or how much I wrestle, it is still in your hands and on your plate to say, then what do I believe about that? And if you believe that your name is submitted to God versus wrestles with God, you'll go home and just try to accept it rather than wrestle with it. He said this, when I was a monk, I wearied myself greatly for almost 15 years. With the daily sacrifice, tortured myself. I earnestly thought to acquire righteousness by my works, with fasting, vigils, prayer, and other various rigorous works. It says that he would attend a confessional, and on his way back, a thought would run through his mind, and he would turn right around and go back again. Doesn't this sound like a religious practice? Doesn't this sound like somebody who, at his heart of hearts, is making every effort to submit to God? Says this, listen to what it produced. If you want to know what kind of a tree you're looking at, look at its fruit. The fruit will tell you what kind of a tree you're looking at. Same is true of Christians. Same is true of people who go, I want a relationship with God. Well, what does the fruit look like? This is the fruit that his efforts were producing. He says, though I lived as a monk without reproach, I felt that I was a sinner before God with an extremely disturbed conscience. Have you ever been there? The harder I try, the worse I get. I'll just try to be a Christian. I could not believe that he was placated by my satisfaction. I did not love. I hated the righteous God who punishes sinners, and secretly, if not blasphemously, certainly murmuring greatly, I was angry with God and said, as if, indeed, it is not enough that miserable sinners, eternally lost through original sin, are crushed by every kind of calamity by the law of the Decalogue without having God add pain to pain by the gospel, and also by the gospel threatening us with his righteousness and wrath. Thus I raised with a fierce and troubled conscience. Let me do the best I can to explain what he's saying. The more I tried, the more I realized I was failing. And the more I failed, the more angry I became at God because I was damned through my sin. And now I was being damned through my attempts. I like this story, but the reason I think I connect to it as deeply as I do is because I have, from my whole life, I can't identify a period in my life where I haven't felt like I struggled with tension. I don't mean physical tension. I don't mean physical pain. I mean spiritual tension of having a heart to go where I'm not, but living where I am. And so there's this constant battle. And I remember years before thinking, maybe the reason, think of this, I hope you leave here wrestling. That's the goal today, okay? That's the goal, is that you feel confident to go home and wrestle with God about whatever's going on in your life. Drop the act that you're submitted. You're not. Maybe you want to be, but you're not. Does that help? Drop the act. You're not going to go home and go, I'm submitted to God. There's a religion for that. But I thought deeply in my heart, if I could just be a better Christian, maybe that's how I get to where I want to be. Every time something bad would happen, and I don't mean bad like tragedy, I mean every time I would face a struggle, every time I faced opposition, I felt like this is the result of not being a better Christian. And what you see in this monk, and I'm going to tell you the rest of this story, it all comes together, but the story of this monk is him going, I have tried everything, and somehow I feel further than closer. It's like I put my head down and started swimming, and I got caught, and am actually further away from the boat than when I started. The hopelessness that's created in this sort of an attempt. Here's what you see, is that the monk wasn't wrestling with God. He wasn't wrestling with God, he was wrestling with the law. He was wrestling with, why does the law exist in the way that it exists? Why does the law consistently condemn me? Why, when I give so much to the practices and the performances, why does it feel like I'm so much further? And then, instead of creating a passion or a love or a relationship with God, it creates resentment and hatred towards God. Why would God create a system like this? And God saying, I didn't name you wrestles with the law. If you've ever thought that your life would be better if you were a better Christian, you're wrestling with the law. If that was true, then why do bad performers sometimes have good circumstances? I mean, the whole concept, the whole theology, the problem is you can't think too much about it, because if you think too much about it, your whole theology, your whole doctrine turns into dust as you watch. If I was a better Christian, I'd have a better circumstances. No, because that means that someone else who has good circumstances must somehow be outperforming you, and that makes you an accuser, and it's gross and it's weird. You've got to come to terms with this idea that you're not wrestling with the law or performance or virtue or earning. God says, I'm okay with you wrestling with me. In fact, that's your name. That's part of what goes on here. That's part of when you walk out into your life, you've got to come to terms with in your walk is that God says, part of what we do is we wrestle. And if you go, oh, not me, God, I'm submitted. Come on. Come on, you perfect Christians. There's two kinds of liars. Those that say they don't wrestle and those that say they're going to stop. God says this is a part of what we do. And when you get distracted and you wrestle with the law and the rules and, oh, I know, here's a new one, it's 2018, we're going to wrestle with grace. I'm in grace, I don't have to listen. No, there is a tension between law and grace. You can't abolish the law. Jesus said, I didn't come to do away with the law. You can't continue sinning. The Bible says who, after receiving salvation, goes right on sinning. So there is a tension between law and grace, and the problem is we don't find the solution when we wrestle with the law or when we wrestle with grace. God's going, hey, remember what I said? Wrestles with me. Come to me with it. We all know that in the end, here's the problem. It's easy to see that sin leads to death, and the church has almost stopped preaching that. The church has almost stopped preaching that sin leads to death. We preach that the law leads to death, because it's so good you can't live up to it. But sin is so bad it will kill you. Sin still kills people. Sin still destroys people's lives. So if you're to the thought like, well, sin's not that bad. No, sin is bad. The law is impossible. So even in this monk's submission, he found himself in a more amount of tension, more tension in his life. Listen to this, 2 Corinthians 12. I love this verse, and I'm not, like I said, I wish I had 2 more weeks to finish this concept, but maybe it'll be a series. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So much in that. He's referencing tension. In your weakness, I'm made strong. In your imperfection, I am made perfect. See, the tension is the balance on both sides. God is saying that in those moments of tension is where I find my perfect plan for you. But that's not what I want to focus on. Just the awareness that tension is present, that tension in your life is present. And God, sometimes I think because I was submitted to God, just submit to God. Okay, God, I get it 100%. I don't get it at all. Then every time there was tension, I thought I was experiencing failure. I thought that when the bills were tight, I had done something wrong. I thought when relationships would fall apart, it was a failure on my part. I thought that there was a solution to every tension, that every tension in my life had a solution, and I just hadn't found it yet. I lived in failure because when there was tension in my life, I identified it as failure. I viewed it as a problem that could be solved. So what Paul's saying is this. He's saying, I'm in a battle. God, I'm in a battle. I've got this thing. And it's if you could take this one thing, and here's the thing, the Bible doesn't say what it is. There's this debate that it was pride. There's this debate that it was his vision, like physically he couldn't see. There's a ton of, but the problem is the Bible doesn't say. So if the Bible doesn't say, then I'm not going to speculate. I just know that it was a source of tension in Paul's life. And Paul said this, he said, if you could just take this thing away, if you could just solve this problem for me, if you could just, I know it's a shortcut, I know I'm asking a lot, but if you could just, I could win this battle with the law. If you would just take this away, then this wrestling with the law, I could do it. And he was so, doesn't that sound like a virtuous request to go home today and go, God, I've only got one sin issue. And if you could take it away, you would have the best Christian in Powell, Butte. But I'm gonna need a little help with that one thing because we both know. Here's the joy. I don't know what your thing is. I just know for a fact that you've got one. I'm not trying to beat you up with it, but if you don't realize that I realize, then you're gonna pretend you're submitted instead of admitting that you're a wrestler. Paul said, if you would take this one thing away, I could win. And God said this. Is it frustrating when God gives you an answer that doesn't feel like an answer, it feels like another question? 3 times I've pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said, my grace is sufficient for you. Huh? That's Bible for no. Paul said, I've got this problem, we take it away, and God says, no, I won't. The moment that God said no, it changed the nature of the thorn. Let me explain what I'm talking about. In Paul's life, the thorn was a problem to be solved until God said no. When God said no, it became a tension that required management. It was not a problem to be solved. It was a tension to be managed. Why? Because God said, I am standing in approval of your wrestling. If you're going to pretend that you're so submitted to God, the problem is the Bible will stand in your way. The Bible becomes very, very difficult to absorb if you believe in your heart of hearts that your motivations are 100% pure. No, they're not. Nobody's is. If you doubt yourself, because at the end of the day you go, oh, am I doing this for the right reasons? That doesn't make you bad, that makes you human. No one's intentions are 100% pure. Paul goes, if you could just take away this final little thing, then I could be perfect. And God goes, well, then if you're not gonna take it away, that changes the nature of the thorn. It is here with your approval. Not that God is approving of the failure. That is a very big distinction. He's not approving of the failure, he's approving of the tension. That when you walk out today and you acknowledge that there is tension in your life, you should take a big breath of fresh air and go, feels so good to admit that. God is aware of your tension and he hasn't removed it, he has intentionally left it. There's gotta be a reason. Paul wasn't wrestling with God, he was wrestling with the law. Around 1500 AD, the church was going through a low point. And what had happened was this, is that they had begun, do your research, it's interesting, I read it, and I'm like, oh, surely not, yeah. They had begun the practice of fundraising through what was called selling indulgences. And the way this works is that all sorts of things. You could call people back up from purgatory for however much amount. There was a price tag. It was like going to the cafe and there's this list of costs, right? And instead of going in and making your confession, because everybody knows that your confession and then that's not going to work. There's got to be a way to capitalize on this. And the church goes, we can monetize this. We've got things we need to build. We've got things, we got funds we got to raise. And around 1500 AD, they decided they're going to start selling indulgences. This actually, if you look back in your history, came with the approval of the Pope. Like the church was in rough shape. And the way that it worked was, if somebody were to come to me and go, Pastor Jordan, because I don't know if you know this, I love that title. Pastor Jordan, and I would go, yes, my child. Father Weaver, let's go with that. Father Weaver, yes, my child. It wasn't, I'm struggling with this sin and I don't know what to do. It was, I've got this sin that I want to commit. See, that's not struggling. That's not struggling. That's full on submitting to your sin. I've got this, because remember, we're wrestling with God. Why is wrestling with God something that God approved of? Why did he give us that name? Why are we allowed to own that name and not feel like failures? I've always thought wrestling with God was what made me a failure. I want to commit a sin. How much is this going to cost me? And with the church's approval, they would write you a little slip. They would get, here's what it's going to cost you. And you go, what? Because your intentions are never 100% pure. What we want to do is whatever we want to do, but then we want to feel good about it. It was like the church had figured out a way to perfectly capitalize on the human nature in every aspect. We want to think that we're right, but then we want to do things we know that are wrong, but we want to feel good about it. Talk about tension. And they were selling indulgences, and they raised a lot of money. I mean, I'm not going to lie, it crossed my mind. Here's what the church needed at that time. The church needed someone who had wrestled with the law and realized that it was impossible. So the tension that was created from the law, but that had battled back and because of the law could better understand the concept of grace. Not a grace apart from the law, a grace that finds itself in the fulfillment of the law. A grace that says, I don't bring myself righteous to God. I become the righteousness of God. That my efforts and my practices and my performances, they're all nothing. What I had to do was I had to figure out that the law had nothing and then wrestle with God, because this monk was saying, I'm so mad at God, but then he goes, I can't be mad at God because then I'm not submitted to God. And around 1517 AD, somewhere in there, it says that this monk had a conversion, and his name, you'll know, Martin Luther. See, the problems to be solved are cheap in comparisons to the tensions to be managed, because he said, I've got to learn how to manage this tension. I can't find peace. I can't find comfort. I seem to be too wrapped into one. I've got this sin nature and the law doesn't rid me of it. And so what he did was he found grace. He found that grace is what happens when God comes in and stoops. Grace is when God stoops down and says, I find favor in you. I love you. I prefer you. And the grace, how could you, knowing how sinful he was and knowing how incapable he was of fulfilling the law, even willing to sleep in the snow? That's a big one for me because I hate snow so much. Like that's like oh my goodness, of all the things he did. But he goes, I've been to the bottom and I've found a never-ending supply of more requirement than my ability to fulfill it. And so the grace, imagine what grace meant to a guy like Martin Luther, who said, I tried for 15 years. More than you or I. So the concept of grace, because of the tension, because tension that God allowed in his life, because of a thorn that God would not remove, the tension created a process that brought about balance. And the balance was, wait a minute, I understand grace, and an indulgence that is sold at a price flies in the face of grace. They say that Martin Luther is the father of the Reformation. He was the one that came in and through what he learned through the law, came in and introduced the concept of grace, that we are saved by grace. The law represents what it represents, but we're not fulfilled, and it's certainly not purchased. Because when you write an indulgence at an X amount of a cost, what you're doing is you are putting a monetary price on the blood of Jesus. And then instead of feeling grateful to God for what God did, you feel entitled because of your purchase price. The indulgence was a demonstration of how we fail when we fail. If you listen to that, thought, that's just a terrible practice of the church. So is wrestling with the law. So is believing that you have anything to offer in the face of the law to cover for your sins. That we don't successfully wrestle with the law and win. We also don't successfully wrestle with grace and win. The tension and the balance leaves us with one option, and that is to carry it to God and learn to wrestle with God. Not oppose God, not fight with God, but not walk away from God. Because think of this, if there was a price that you could pay so that Jesus became unnecessary, you found the ticket that allows you to leave Jesus. The balance of law and grace is what causes us to go, then I have no other option. I've got to go to God with this and go, God, why am I this way? Why is there tension in my life? Why is there frustration in my life? Why am I battling the things that I'm battling? And you're the only place that I can find answers. He wrote the disputation on the power and efficacy of indulgences, and he nailed it to the door at the Wittenberg Castle at a time when grace desperately needed a voice. Isn't that interesting that we think of grace as being kind and soft? And grace is the thing that confronts the law in our lives. Without grace, the law doesn't make sense to us. And without the law, grace doesn't make any sense. And there is that tension that we can't fulfill on our own. That's why 2 Corinthians 12:9, God says, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. Here's what I believe God was saying to Paul. Here's what I believe God's saying to you, because I don't know you intimately, but I know that you are people. And as people, we're all sort of branded with the same struggle, and that is, how do we do it? If we could do it better, would life be better? You know what's even scarier? Is when the circumstances are good and there's still tension. When you accomplish your goals and there's still tension, and there's this constant back and forth in our spirit that we constantly feel, and we're always looking for a way to solve the tension. Paul said, God, I've almost got it. I'm almost the perfect Christian. I almost have no place that I could be accused. I've almost gotten to a place in my life where I could stand with confidence, and instead of wrestling with God, I know then that I would be on equal footing. I know then that I could be accepted. It's one thing. I got this one thing. And what's funny is that Paul didn't have one thing. Paul still had millions of things. He just thought he had one thing. You have millions of things. If you've narrowed it down to one, it means that it's broaden the scope. You know what I think is possible? I think it's possible that Paul had finally gotten under control all the things he struggled with. I think it's possible that Paul's issue was pride. The Bible, it's possible. I'm perfect. I'm better than all of you. Oh no, it started over. I think what he was saying was this, is he said, Paul, I can, here's what I know about God. God's not insecure. If you come to God and you go, God, I've got an issue. This doesn't make any sense. God's not gonna go, how dare you? He didn't name you submitted. He named you wrestles. And so when you come to God and you engage God at a personal level, when you walk out of here with questions, you're on the right track. When you walk out of here going, I don't know if I understand that. I don't know if I get that. You're on the right track. That doesn't disqualify you. That means you're a step closer. And what I believe God was saying to Paul was, Paul, listen, I can afford to have you wrestle with me. I could have you argue with me. Look at Jacob. Jacob's just fighting with God. He wouldn't give up. And then all of a sudden, through the fighting, he finds himself broken and clinging to Jesus. And Jesus goes, this is what wrestling does. It brings you to a place where you're clinging to Jesus. I'm not so insecure that I can't have, listen, God is not so insecure that you questioning something makes him feel uncomfortable. But what he will not afford is us believing that we're capable of the Christian life apart from him. Just give me the keys, I'll drive. How many times, though? How many times do we think, I could almost do this. I could do that, I could do that. I'm a good Christian. I'm doing better than I used to. Okay. Well, thank you, every single person in the building. God's going, the risk is not that you win the battle. The risk is that you solve the tension and your life has none. Then all of a sudden you look up and there is no tension driving you to deeper. What is it that drove Martin Luther in a moment where he was full on submitted to the law? What kept him from going further into the law? The tension in his life that was dragging him back towards grace. If you identify tension as positive and beneficial, then this. God would rather have you wrestling than thinking that you're submitted. God would rather you own this wrestling concept of, I don't get that, I don't understand that, I don't like that, I don't agree with that. Have you ever thought, have you ever read something in the Bible, that seems like a, how many times do you hear people accuse the Bible? Can't read the Bible. It says this over here and says that over there. That is an opportunity to wrestle through something and grow and go deeper and dig and gain, and instead it's like, no, it doesn't, it's just because. It's almost like we're spiritually almost crippled or handicapped or inward turned because we're so afraid that if we actually begin to question, what we're going to find is that we don't have the answers, and if we don't have the answers, we can't stay submitted to God. And God's going, it's not about that. I can live with you wrestling. What I can't afford is for you to have a life that's free of tension. Because the tension is not there to be solved, it's there to create positive in you. So towards the end of Paul's ministry, Paul writes this. So he's already said, God, please take my thorn away. And God said, no. So this is what Paul has battled through. He's gone through shipwrecks, he's been in jail, he's been beaten, he's been flogged, he's had people that have converted, he's experienced miracles. You want to talk about a ministry that is the demonstration of tension. And towards the end of all of this, sort of as things are winding down for Paul, Paul writes this. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 12, it says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. What word is he talking about there? Tension. He said, I know what it's like to be over here, and I know what it's like to be over there. I know what it's like to be on both ends. I've learned the secret of being content in every situation. What did he just say there? I have learned the secret to being content in my tension. To embrace the idea that God is going to put you in times of need. He's going to put you in times of plenty. And that is not an indication of your failure. It is not an indication of your success. Sometimes God is just doing something in your life. Have you ever heard the quote, sometimes we're on the wrong side of the tapestry? Do you know what that means? Sometimes God is doing something beautiful on one side of your life, but all you can see is the knots and the strings and the chaos. That the tension in your life so often is creating something beautiful on the other side while you're learning how to battle and find contentment in the tension. Whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or want. And then he says one of the most famous scriptures in the Bible, I can do all things through him who gives me strength. When I go to the place that I know I can find answers, when I go to a place where I'm allowed to wrestle with, doesn't that paint God in a more clear picture in your mind? That he's not waiting with a hammer and just gavel like guilty. He says he's called us sons and daughters. We've been invited in, and that when we get to a place in our heart where we're not so threatened by this concept of wrestling with God, then we begin to find answers. When we're willing to push into what seems like a contradiction, when we're willing to push into what seems like a false identity, when we get to a place where we interact, and the problem is this, I don't know how to do that yet. I don't mean me. Every week, you guys get to be a part of whatever it is that we've got going on as far as tension. Whatever tension is producing in my life, you guys get to be witness. But here's what is bugging me, and here's where this sermon just falls off a cliff for me, is that you have got to figure out how to wrestle. And so often, you can't wrestle if you keep your mouth closed. Because you're not taking a stance. You're not claiming an opinion. You're not taking ownership of something that you believe. If the enemy can keep your mouth closed because you're in a moment of tension and he can make you question your submission to God, then all of a sudden your witness is broken and you're silent. But there's tension in that, because what we don't want is for you to put a sandwich board over yourself and go stand on the street corner. This is not billboard Christianity. It's how do we learn to wrestle in a way that's effective, because your struggle opens up God to other people. When people see you struggle, when people see you working through things, so many times they go, I've wondered that. That happened in my life. Okay, what's God doing in your life? And we have got to solve that at a format level. We've got to get to a place where you can take ownership of your tension, where you can find contentment in the tension. Instead of saying, oh, if God would take this thorn away, I could go to church and I wouldn't even feel bad. Maybe if God would take this thorn away, maybe I could even raise my hands in worship. See the danger in this? That because we view tension as a problem that needs solved, we feel inadequate. We feel broken. We feel unqualified to have an opinion. We feel unqualified to share our faith when God opens opportunities. And it's like we live as intimidated, quiet, meek versions of what God intended. I kind of wish I had another week to look further into this. I would love to know what the solution is. And it may not be a week-long solution. I don't know. But I know that we've got to become people who are willing to wrestle with God. We've got to become people who quit wrestling with the law and quit wrestling with grace. God didn't call us wrestles with grace. He didn't call us wrestles with the law. He says, come to me. And the longer you stay, the more you overcome. Because remember, he didn't say that Jacob overcame because he beat Jesus. He said you overcame because you experienced loss, you experienced tension, and you stayed. How do we get to a place where we can wrestle through what God's doing in our lives while we stay and we become effective in the moments of tension? Let's pray. Lord, I don't like sermons that end in question marks. But Lord, just like Paul, I think sometimes we're tempted to believe that if we could perform the law, if we were better Christians, then we would be better qualified. And that's not the call. The call is bring it to me. Wrestle through it with me. Wrestle through it. There's nothing about your word that would indicate that you're intimidated by our questions or by our struggles or by our battles. God, I don't read anywhere in there that says with a pure heart when we're digging deeper that you're frustrated with us by that. I think so often the American church, and I've been guilty of it, God, we put so much focus on that sin issue, that sin area. If we could just get rid of that, and we find ourselves wrestling with the law in an effort to remove tension. And God, help us to be people who find contentment in the tension, who can embrace it, because just like Martin Luther, God, it was the tension that brought about the Reformation. It was the tension in one man's life that you used to bring the church back and put it back on track and move us back towards individual grace through your blood, not through works or indulgences. Put that into focus, Lord. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.